Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this new episode of All Things Policy. We will be discussing the Karnataka government's ban on the bike taxis in Bangalore with Anupam Manur, Professor of Economics here at the Takshashila Institution. Anupam has also written an article on money control on the subject. To explain the topic to you, the Karnataka government has enforced a ban on bike taxis in Bangalore following a High Court ruling that upheld the prohibition. This decision has led to significant disruptions in urban mobility, especially for commuters relying on affordable last-mile connectivity. The ban has left many commuters without affordable transportation options, particularly affecting students, part-time workers, and part-time workers who relied on bike taxis for cost-effective and timely travel. The government cited safety concerns, particularly for women passengers, and the illegal use of non-commercial vehicles as primary reasons for the ban. Additionally, the lack of regulatory oversight and proper licensing for bike taxi operations contributed to the enforcement action. Anupam, can you explain what were the implications of that led to where we are right now with the ban on the bike taxis? And can you elaborate on the economic implications of this ban for gig economy workers and the broader informal sector in Bangalore?
All right, sure, Leah. That's quite a tall ask, but okay, let's get started. It's quite interesting. I think all of the justifications given by the government on women's safety and all of that is a post facto justification, as in that's not really the core reasons as to why they brought about this ban. The ban had to come about simply because they do not recognize two-wheelers as commercial operations, right? So if you look at how a taxi kind of market works, they have, let's say, a broad Motor Vehicles Act, under which they say you can own a car for private use, which will have like your black and white board, and you can have a car for a commercial use, which will be registered differently, which will have a different kind of licensing system, and that will have your yellow and black board, right? And in between, you also have a black and yellow board, which is basically where you can rent a car, right? You don't own it, you can rent a car. Yes. So these are different types of vehicles, right? Based on purpose or use, and therefore different sets of rules will apply to these different types of vehicles. Right? Or different kind of boards and so on.
Yes.
In the bike ecosystem, there is just no such differentiation. There is now your standard black and white. You do have a rental thing, which is where, in that space, your Bounce and Vogo, whatever operated in Bangalore. So you could rent a bike. That was fine. That there was at least legal provisions for that. You have now a green whatever board which says it's an EV. There's no other rules regarding that. But mainly, in any of the rules, current set of rules and regulations and policies, there is just no acknowledgement of the existence of bikes for commercial purposes.
Right.
And that's the main problem. So if you don't recognize the existence of a bike as a commercial entity, then you can't regulate it. And if you can't regulate it and there's not even an acknowledgement of its existence, then basically it's deemed illegal. So right now, all of the operations of bike taxis were deemed to be illegal. That's where they're coming from. So the transport department basically wrote, letters to all of your Rapido, Ola and Uber, etc., saying you have to stop and cease your operations because we don't recognize what you're doing as a legal commercial activity. And so you have to stop it. Now, once they kind of came up with that idea to ask them to stop, obviously the companies themselves were not too happy about it. They were not too keen on stopping their operations because they were earning money through it. And so they went to the High Court and said, they're asking us to stop, but can you intervene? And their main point was, yes, the Karnataka rules don't really recognize bike taxis, but there is a set of union government guidelines on policy matters, especially on bike taxis, saying that it is allowed. So can you not use that as the basis for allowing us to exist, right? The High Court thought about this, and then there was a single panel judge which said, I'm sorry, but transport is a state subject, and so therefore the state government has to recognize it as a commercial entity. And if it doesn't, then, well, you can't operate it, right? So this is all par for the course. I mean, if you look at the sequence of events, it makes logical sense. You have to be recognized as a business for you to operate, in that area, right? So, for example, if I'm producing, I don't know, if I come up with a factory which is producing mobile phones, then mobile phones as a product has to be considered as a legal product in the definition of, your government, right? If not, if I manufacture mobile phones and start selling it, it will still be considered illegal. Similarly, for any product or any service, it has to be recognized as a legal service or a product, right? So the bike taxis, the big problem is that it was not recognized as a legal commercial activity at all.
Yeah.
So the High Court then, in that kind of scenario, the High Court judgment makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Of course, what I would have expected the High Court to do is use a little bit more discretion and say, yes, as it stands today, this is illegal, but they could have directed the state government to say, hey, frame policies on this. One way or the other. For example, the High Court could say, you could frame a policy around this. That's what the legislation is supposed to do. Mm-hmm. You could frame a policy saying, it is illegal, if at all you think it is, or you frame policy saying, okay, it's legal and you have to follow all of these rules. But not having a policy on it at all and thereby banning it. So the ban comes really not because of policy saying it's banned, but the ban is in place just because there's no laws around it at all. Right? And for me, this is where it seems extraordinarily stupid, where the government is saying, hey, you're banned because we don't have a law on you. Well, it's the government's job to make these laws. Right? This for me is extraordinarily stupid. So you make your set of laws. You make a policy around it saying, whatever, it is legal, it is illegal, you're legal, but you have to follow all of these standards. There's a whole bunch of things that they can do, right? For me, the failure to do that and thereby stopping, these activities going through is nonsensical. Let me add to this. If you think, they've not had time to do so or it's just a little bit too quick, that again doesn't this thing, right? So that doesn't hold water because the first introduction of bike taxis in Bangalore was in 2015 by Rapido.
Yeah.
That is 10 years back. I think 10 years is just about enough to create policies around something, don't you, Leah? So,
yeah.
And not just that, in a neighboring state in Goa, I think you would know this, being a resident of Goa at various points in your life. Goa has had bike taxis legally since the 1980s and, in the grey zone since the 1970s, right? So 1970s, first kind of set of bike taxis, pilots as they call them, were introduced. They worked well. In the 1980s, the Goan government said, okay, let's legislate on this and let's create a set of laws to say, okay, how do we regulate this? And it became official in 1980s, right? And since then it's worked and it works well, reasonably well in Goa for people who want to avail of that service. So, you've had at least precedents from 1980s until now. So that is a 35 years time frame and 10 years at least in Bangalore. So you can't say, you're caught off guard and you've not had time to create policy, right? So, yeah.
Right.
So that's how we got here. But your other question of economic implications, I think, is massive. And, we can slice and dice that in many ways. One is just what does it do for commuters? What does it do for the riders themselves? What does it do to the ecosystem? There's a lot of things that we can pass through. So we'll start with the idea that, let's start with the commuters. I think already in the last 1 or 2 days, and maybe, it's a bit too early to have official statistical data, but by anecdotal data and at least asking a lot of people in office who used to use bike taxis, I think it's already quite clear that prices have gone up, right? And it's obviously expected. If the supply of transport as a larger thing goes down, then the demand is the same at least, and then price obviously will go up, right? So that's a natural mechanism under which it operates. So prices of autos have gone up, prices of cabs have gone up, and that's only to be expected because that was one kind of alternative that existed, which no longer exists, and that's going to put a lot more pressure on the other systems, right? On autos, cabs, and so on. So prices have gone up. Difficulty in obtaining transport, which is already a complete nightmare in Bangalore, it is only going to become worse. You're going to have longer wait times for riders. You're going to have much more cancellations for autos because now, they can choose, right? The supply can choose between exceeding demand. So they can choose this entire thing where people are getting really angry about, the tipping, the pre-tipping.
Yes.
That's only going to get worse because there's going to be a supply crunch and huge demand. And so, you're only going to get more and more of this thing. The only way to kind of fix this is by surge pricing.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to do surge pricing in order to, match supply to demand. And now you've got some stupid rules against surge pricing as well, saying you can't do surge pricing. So then they'll find innovative ways to do surge pricing. And this pre-tipping is just that, right? It is surge pricing which is hidden as, as a tip.
Right.
But doesn't matter, right? The prices will go up, and it's the only way. And unfortunately, people will get angry at these cab companies saying, oh, you're exploiting, you're charging. But what can anyone do? There's only, they had a supply. And now you've removed that. So the only way to adjust for the market dynamics is through the pricing system.
Yeah. Right. Thanks for that, Anupam. And it calls to mind also, there are, even with certain apps, like if you look at Namayatri, where it's not just the tipping feature as well on the app, but they also give a broad pricing range. Anywhere for 2-kilometer ride is anywhere between 60 to 90 rupees in the morning.
Yeah.
Right. So an auto driver is more likely to accept the ride if it's on the higher end of the scale.
Obviously.
With an added tip to it.
Yeah.
So, it, like you said, it makes the range, the availability of autos in the morning, especially for commuters going to work in a rush, it's an impossible task.
Yeah, and this is, I would say this is particularly poor, but at least on the poorer sections of society, as in you can imagine that if the richest people, if we can draw that correlation, right? The richest people would use cabs or have their own transport, can afford their own car and the singer and have a driver and so on, right?
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. Who are the people who are more likely to use bike taxis? Either they're in a rush, which is fine, or they want to spend less on transportation, right? They have lesser disposable income that they want to dedicate towards transportation, right? And now you've taken away that option from them, forcing them to now pay more, or at least switch to more costlier options, which is only going to get more costlier because of the supply shortage, right? So in all ways, in every single possible way, what you've done is made it horrible for the poorer sections of society, right? So now your students who would typically use, let's say, a person who's just entered the workforce, who doesn't have a lot of disposable income, or a set of people who don't have their own car, etc., or maybe an immigrant into the city who's not had time to set up their own this thing. All of these, right?
Which happens because we have so many companies, so many new jobs coming up, so many people from different cities migrating into Bangalore. So
correct. So all of these are the sets of people who are going to get affected by this, right? And for me, that seems absolutely unconscionable to do this. So that's just on commuters. Then the next big effect is on traffic itself.
Yes.
And that is huge. Bangalore is already one of the slowest cities in the world to drive in, right? You have your TomTom index, etc. Bangalore is in the top 10 in every single way. Average vehicular speed in Bangalore is one of the lowest in the world. So you already have huge traffic snarls. You have gridlocks. You have, massive jams, all of these things. And then what have you done? You forced one option away, which could effectively navigate through this traffic and so on, and you force that away. Now you're going to force more people to, go on to other things. Now you're forcing people to either take autos or cabs, which is going to add to the traffic, or buy their own car. They'll ultimately say, hey, listen, public transport in this city, in Bangalore, is completely and utterly unreliable. So either I'm going to buy my own two-wheeler or my own car.
Right.
And that's what's going to happen. And that's only going to add to the mess. So now you have and it's going to be anti-environment as well, because now you had a two-wheeler that could do multiple trips. You're going to get more out of, this thing out of the two-wheeler. Now, you can't do that. So people will go and buy their own two-wheelers, right?
Right.
So in every single way possible, you're going to make traffic worse and you're going to make commuters' life worse.
Right. Yeah. And I'm also, what also comes to mind is that, again, recently, just a few months ago, they increased the price of metro fares as well, where the price cap was at around 71%. So with a 71% increase. So what used to be a 30 rupee ride was now a 60 rupee ride from one point to another. But
So all of this, that's what you have to look at all of this in parallel, right? And that is because, they've done also some other things to do with buses and, it's entirely lopsided. But I'll come to that later, right? How do you look at transport as this holistic thing? We'll try and come to that later.
Right.
But as of now, this for me is a completely kind of ridiculous move. Bike taxis, by the way, did nearly, I think, 8 crore trips in a year in a city like Bangalore, right? Now, all of those rides have to be substituted in one way or the other, right? And that substitution is going to cost a lot. It's going to cost a lot to commuters, and it's going to cost a lot in terms of traffic jam. So there's going to be lost productivity. There's going to be, because people are now waiting longer to get a transport. They have to start earlier in the day. They're sleeping less. I mean, you'd think it's a simple enough policy move, but it's going to have tremendous repercussions throughout the system. And I've not even come to the lost jobs. I'm waiting for you to ask me that.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question, actually. And also about, since it's a gig economy, how is this affecting the broader informal sector in Bangalore and the gig economy? And the government also, this is a later question, something that we can come into later, but also the government had cited safety concerns as an issue and misuse of non-transport vehicles as a reason for the ban, which seems logical, which seems right, but again, the implication of this ban is so huge. So we'll begin with, what does this ban mean for the gig economy workers and the informal sector?
Yeah, I think that is quite huge, right? So you've had 1 million people who are employed in this bike taxi kind of business in Bangalore, right? So there's 1 lakh people who were employed in the bike taxi. That's why I was thinking something is wrong. So 100,000 or 1 lakh people who were employed as a bike taxi, whatever, pilot, etc. That is a direct loss of jobs.
Yes.
Right? That's a direct loss of jobs for these people who will now have to find something else. And remember, in India, the gig economy works very differently than what it's supposed to be, right? In the traditional idea of gig economy means that, you have a person who's doing some other job, but who might just, have a two-wheeler spare time and say, okay, I'm going to do a few trips. That's how the gig economy is supposed to work. A gig essentially means like a freelance project, a small kind of work, right?
Side hustle.
A side hustle. That's not the case in Bangalore or in India generally, right? This is the main source of income for that 1 lakh people, right? So you've lost the main means of livelihood for these 1 lakh people.
Yeah.
And that will have deep, again, repercussions on their lives. I mean, it's not a small thing, right? They've lost their means of livelihood. So now they have to scramble around and find some other jobs. Maybe they'll do delivery, etc. Now, for me, that question, and I don't want to say this out because I don't want to give any ideas already to the stupid set of ideas that are out there. But, using a bike for delivery of products is also for commercial purposes. So technically, even that should be banned, but I don't want to say it out aloud because, the government is...
Funnily enough, there's also, whether it's true or not, I'm not sure, but discussion or talks about how they've, instead of changing it from the bike taxi, they've changed it to a bike parcel service where people rent out or hire out the bike for themselves and on the lines of the parcel service rather than it being...
So people are basically saying that I'm the parcel, and so if you can use a bike for parceling, then parcel me, right? Gives a whole new meaning to human trafficking, but here it is voluntary human trafficking, right? So
humans in traffic.
Yeah, that's what. So a multiple layered joke that is. But so you're gonna, there's obviously loss of jobs for all of those people. But beyond that, remember, these are people who were earning bit and then, earning whatever they were earning and then using that money to buy other things and so on. So there's going to be a depression in all of the other areas as well in which, there was consumption happening by these people, right? So there's going to be second order effects, which is not to be discounted at all. So, if 1 lakh people overnight lose their jobs, that's going to have effect on the economy. Right? That's going to definitely have an effect on the economy. And that is something that you should be, wary of as well. So, and this, remember, in a situation where we are always complaining that India is not creating enough jobs, right? We have a massive unemployment problem. We had looked at the gig economy as one kind of, avenue for job growth. And then we keep shooting ourselves in the foot by doing things like this. Right? Makes absolutely no sense. The safety concern, right? So yeah, the idea that bike taxis or whatever for safety, etc. For me, again, it makes very little sense. That's where regulation comes in, right? That's so as I said, inherently, with absolutely no rules, a car is an extremely unsafe instrument.
True. Yeah.
If you had no rules around seat belts, mandatory, speed limits, or traffic rules, or which direction you should be going, imagine if just you put a bunch of cars together on the road and say, do whatever you want. Of course, they're going to all crash into each other in like no time, right? But we've evolved a system. Instead of banning cars, we've evolved a system which has made them safer. We've said, okay, you have to wear a seatbelt, you have to go, on the left side of the road, you have to stop at red signals, you have to, you can't drive above 80 on the highway, above 40 on the normal road. There's all of these systems of rules we have made, which has made safer. So you can't ban something which is inherently valuable because it's unsafe, right? Because then everything under the sun is unsafe potentially.
Right.
But you make rules to make them safer. And then at the margin, people will decide there is a trade-off. Yes, maybe bikes are not as safe as cars, but then you make that trade-off, right? Of course, even autos are not as safe as cars. Autos can get toppled, but people make those trade-offs all the time, saying, okay, I will trade off 5% risk of whatever in exchange for one, cheaper mobility, and two, quicker mobility, right? And so people are capable of making these decisions. Adults are capable of making these decisions, and so you should allow them to, right? And then if bikes are inherently unsafe, how is it okay to sell bikes then? We sell bikes. We sell two-wheelers. How is that not unsafe?
Yeah.
So if that is safe, then so can bike taxis. So, I mean, it makes absolutely zero sense to me.
And in terms of regulation as well, I mean, like there have been so many hurdles, like you mentioned in your article as well, about hurdles about regulation and the fact that even autos, for that matter, don't even have meters. They're basically ornaments that they have.
Relics I call them. From a distant age. Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that they're saying, suddenly the government is all worried about rules and regulations and so on, where there is blatant violation of rules by the autos, by a whole bunch of these things. So the answer is not in banning, but setting up rules that you can actually enforce, right? But for me, what's a little bit more disturbing, I'm going to come back to the idea of governance, and a little bit more disturbing is that I go back, right? So I go back to the idea that you have a massive traffic problem. You have an unemployment problem. You have a problem to do with, just the mobility problem. And every time that there is some sort of solution that has come about by private players, by private enterprise to kind of solve for that, there is massive amounts of roadblocks, excuse the pun, by the government, regulatory hurdles, cholesterol, right, that doesn't allow them to be. Right. So you had, for example, in Bangalore itself, right? I'm going to take Bangalore here. But in Bangalore, you had, for example, ideas for shared autos, which have still not come into being, right? There might be just one or two places where shared autos work, but otherwise they don't.
They've just started it on Rapido, I believe.
Yeah, but in most other parts of the country, shared autos has been existing before the digital age, right? But in Bangalore, they don't. You had ideas for shared buses, by the way. Uber had an Uber shuttle bus, which was, again, not allowed. And there was other companies, I don't remember even. See, it's been that long. But there was an idea that, you have 12, 14 people who all wanted it. There would be matchmaking and a bus would, mini bus. Those are the ideas that you need. You had, for example, Uber Pool, Ola Share, whatever that existed, right? Which was shared taxis. You then deemed that illegal because of some stupid rule that was written in like the 1940s or something, right? The Stage Carriage Act and the Contract Carriage Act, etc., which said that, once you pick up a person from one place, you could not make any stops until you drop that person. Right. And a shared taxi, for example, would be in violation of that, and so therefore we don't have shared taxis. So, and the worst of all, which really got my goat, Leah, is that we banned carpooling for profit. Right? So you had something like Quick Ride, which said, okay, you could, 4 or 5 people going in the same direction, one person drives, bears the cost, but, others pay them. Of course, the platform will make a commission. They should. And we banned that. When in a city which is known for its gridlocks, which is almost like a national joke, You've destroyed avenues for making traffic easier, which is carpooling. Every other city in the world is begging its residents to say, please carpool. And what do? We ban carpooling. I mean, it's so idiotic that I can't even, I mean, it's beyond a joke, right? We're suffering because of it, which is why I can't make a joke out of it. Otherwise, it would be, I mean, I think we deserve to be laughed at for this.
Right.
I have not even gotten the kind of extraordinary steps we have taken to shoot ourselves in the foot, right, is just mind-boggling. At every step of the way, we've stopped innovations from happening. For me, it feels like the government is at war with its own people. That's what it seems to me. You know, they're sadistic people who want to see people suffer. That's the only conclusion I can draw from all of this.
Right. And there are other cities in India that have put in place some framework of some kind of regulatory models that have successfully integrated, like you mentioned, like in Goa, they integrated bike taxis into their transportation networks. And do you think that there's a way for us to do that?
It's not at all a problem. It's the simplest of things. All you have to do is set a bunch of rules around, for example, okay, if safety, you say mandatory helmets. You can put a speed limit on it, for example. You can say, you can have even an SOS button or something like that, which for me doesn't do anything. But nonetheless, you can, for example, install that. Then you need insurance, right? So
Yes.
you deem that as legal, and then you have a separate kind of insurance policy if you're using it for commercial purposes. That's all. I mean, there's just few of those things and you can make the rule, right?
Yeah.
So Maharashtra has, by the way, a set of rules already which, incorporate this. Goa has. There's national guidelines. So there's, the union government has set up a bunch of guidelines on this which you can use and, make that. So I don't think that is the problem at all. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to, it's not like you're trying to regulate cryptocurrency or something where you don't understand it, right? This is one of the easiest things to do. And yet, so the reason is not any of this, right? It's not safety. It's not that you don't know how to regulate it. Let's be clear on this. There's a very strong political economy problem here, right? Which is the autos and the auto unions, right? So the auto unions in Bangalore especially has been extremely strong, and for reasons that I cannot fathom or even begin to comprehend, they have disproportionate amount of influence on policymaking in the state, in Karnataka, right? They have literally held successive governments hostage and made them incorporate rules in manner which is completely kind of counterproductive and counterintuitive and to the general masses, right? So even first time when Uber and Ola, for example, came in, when, by the way, Bangalore has not had fly-down taxis. Most people will scoff at this, but Bangalore doesn't have fly-down taxis. So what you have, your yellow and black taxis in Mumbai or your classic yellow ambassadors in Kolkata and so on. Bangalore's never had that because of the auto unions. Even when Uber and Ola came in, by the way, they were not allowed to ply. They had to go through massive amounts of hurdles, etc. And then, finally they were allowed. Bike taxis, there are cases where taxi, whatever pilots have been beaten up by the auto unions.
Right.
And that's why I say it's rich that the government suddenly says, rules and regulations, because they're turning a blind eye to all of this, this while, right? So these are the things that makes zero sense to me. The fact that an entire government has allowed itself to be completely taken over by an auto union of all the things, right? For me, it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, we have seen big factory unions, etc., being disproportionately powerful, but we are talking about auto unions, right? And that is completely kind of taken over policy making in this thing. And for me, that's the only reason why bike taxis have been disallowed in the state. Everything else is superfluous. Everything else is, post facto justification. The real reason is the fact that you have auto unions who form a strong political bloc and politicians dancing to their tunes and policymakers dancing to their tunes, unfortunately, instead of coming up with their own set of, policies which will benefit the larger public.
Right. I think with that, we can close our discussion on this topic. I'm sure there are a lot of people that this ban has affected. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And hope you tune in for the next episode of All Things Policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.